Hey, good afternoon. Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Managers, back for another round of one-on-one with Database and me. Going to talk about pagination today. Big exciting topic. Big exciting topic. So I've got pagination working pretty well. I can go forward and backward. There's some edge cases that I've got some issues on, but you can see I've got a list here. This is a search for the two most recent clients added to the database with my ID. That's something we'll talk about in a little bit. But basically, I can go forward and get the next set of results, and then I can get the next set of results. And here I'm at the end of the results. And if I go back, I can head back to the beginning. So that's where I am right now. I just kind of wanted to document where I'm at because things are probably going to change. I just wanted to show how I got here at least. Notice that this should be grayed out. I'm at the beginning of my search, so if I hit previous, I shouldn't even be able to hit previous because I'm at the beginning. I need to detect that. And also when I get to the end, this should be grayed out. I shouldn't be able to hit next. So that's some functionality I need to add. And also if I do hit next, I get an empty array here, and now everything's broken because the way my search works, it depends on that last search. So let's dig into the code, and I'll kind of show what's happening, and then kind of talk about those edge cases maybe a little bit. So the search all starts. This is my dashboard, which is the the view that's loaded when you first log in, as you would want. For most people would want a dashboard. So this is the start of the dashboard. I'm making this a component so that I can reuse it with different searches. Instead of my caregivers, I might do all employees that have updated a caregiver, and then maybe something else, other searches, and I'm trying to componentize it so I can just reuse the same code. So anyway, we're on that dashboard. Here's that dashboard, and right now I've just got the search hard-coded. Ultimately, just like I do with my my entities that I've talked about in previous videos, where I configure my database based on entities, I'm probably going to have to configure what searches you want on the dashboard in some kind of configuration file that will also, again, ultimately be written by a a front-end program if I ever actually get that far. So, or get some help. Hint, hint, if anybody's actually watching these videos. So this is my search. This is how I set up the search. So it's typical stuff you would need for a search, right? Which collection am I searching on? Well, I'm searching on the root entity in this case. And what am I searching for? What the where clause? I'm searching for the created at UID, so the most recently created. I'm sorry. The where is who created it. So what user ID created it, and currently I'm in this one using the ID of the person that's currently logged in. So I store my user in the store when I first load the app and sign into Firebase, and then here I'm retrieving that UID and saying, hey, we're going to do a search for all the all the clients that were created by this user. So then I'm going to order by the created at date, so the date it was last created, or the date it was first created. It can only be created once. And the order I'm going to go is I'm going to descend it. So the most recent should be first if it's descending, because the highest created at date will show up at the top. I'm going to limit right now. I mean, I could change this limit to anything, 20, 30, whatever. Right now I've got a small database, so I'm just trying to do proof of concept, so I'm limiting my search to just 2 results, and that's why we see only 2 results showing up per per session, per click. And then I need this query ID thing. I'll talk about that in a second. That labels what the query is, because I have to have a listener that's going to live listen to the changes. So if I start to talk about having 2 different searches, or actually even, oh shoot, of course I did that. So if I've got 3 searches going, if these are 3 different machines and we got a live database here, and somebody goes in and updates Marco Polo and wants it to be Marco Polo maybe, we should see that update across the other 2. So it's all real time, it's all live, which makes things fairly complicated, especially when we start deleting. I'll talk about that. Depending on which direction we're searching, the deletes end up different because of some tricks I have to do with Firebase. Firebase does not have strong backwards pagination. It's very good at going forward, but not backwards, and I'll talk about that at some point. So anyway, back to the code that, so that's what this myRecent is for. It's just a unique label that needs to be sent in to track, track that search for that individual component. So if I end up having, this same component, if I do it here with a different search, they need to be they need to be identified as separate. So that's kind of all that's doing. And again, I'll talk about that in a little bit. The route base it sends in so that it knows where the links go to. That's something that hopefully I can make less hard-coded later. And the title that's going to go at the top. That's this right here, this title there. So where are we? We're on the dashboard. We set up this. We set up this entity search object. So this is my parameters for my search, and I'm going to ultimately send that to a component that's going to display that, find and display the search results based on those parameters. And that entity search just basically, here's my components. I've shown this in the past. This is basic Vue stuff. I create the variable name. That's what sets up the component name. And I tell it where it comes from. It comes from entity search, which is this import, which is the entity search.vue. So I'm basically embedding this entity search.vue in my dashboard as a component, and then I'm sending it, this object that contains the information on what and how to search. So I'm passing that into the entity search as a variable called search parameters. So if we go into entity search, we will then see that those parameters come in as a prop, search parameters, and as they're highlighted, you can see I use them a few times as I pass it through. And basically, this sets up the display. So this code up here is showing my results of the search and setting up the how those results are displayed by last name, first name. This is again something I need to, what I keep saying, abstract out, because if the search doesn't have a last name field, this will fail. So that's still hard coded. But anyway, just as a full reference, so we're setting this up right here. So you can see that the toolbar title comes in as the param search.title, which I talked about was the caregivers. And then this loop that I'm doing here, this v4 loop, that's what's looping over these pieces here and showing the last name comma first name, which is this stuff right here. So this loop right here creates this these outputs right here. And then I've got a paginate, a previous, and if we look here, previous and a next button, and those are set up here. I've got a previous button here with an on-click event that calls paginate backwards. And then in the forward direction, I've got that next button, which is here. That's this button. And that calls, when I click it, that calls paginate in the forward direction. So when I click next, I'm calling paginate forward. And when I click previous, I'm calling paginate backwards. So they're the same function. I'm just telling it which direction to go. And that is down here in my methods. Here's my paginate method, and it receives the direction. It adds the direction, or adds that direction to a paginate direction parameter on the original search parameters. And then I call the search, get root entity search, root entity recent. My names are kind of screwed up. This should be a better name. But notice that when I click a button, that's the paginate. It calls this get root entity recent, which is also called on the created. So whether I'm paginating forward or backwards, or I'm initially setting up the page, which is what the created function does, I'm calling this get root entity recent function in the store. That's what a dispatch does. It's an asynchronous dispatch to go and get some information. So let's take a look at this this function in storage. So here's the store, and here's that get root entity recent function that I'm calling. So again, if we go back to the entity search, my paginate function and my initial creation, when I initially set up the page, I call that function that's right here. So it is an action. If I scroll far enough, I need to parse out this file and get it separate. But it's in the actions section of the store, and the store this is a Vuex store, right? If you've been following along, you should have seen that in previous videos. So the first thing I do is this is some logging just for debugging, so we don't need to really concern ourselves with that too much. The first thing I do is check for this listeners thing, and I set it up as an object. This is just housekeeping to make sure it is an object so I don't get an error, because I can store, again, on this listeners object, you know, I'll be able to store all kinds of different searches on it for each one of the, so each one of these components, if I repeat it, you know, if I take this component and I repeat it here on the same page, I'll have a search listener for each one of those going. And so I need to store those listeners somewhere, and I'm storing them on a global object in the Vuex storage. So I could set this up as an object originally. I'm just got this weird thing that I'm doing where I'm making sure that I'll come back to this, where I want all my variables to be able to start out null. And that way, when I delete them and whatnot, I have a consistent state that I'm starting from. So anyway, back to here. So again, this is probably unnecessary. If I would have just set it to an object originally above, that would have been fine. Now here's where we check for a listener. So if it's our first time through, which means dashboard is calling entity search, and entity search is calling get root entity on the created function, which means we haven't done anything yet. We're just initially setting things up. That means we won't have a listener, so we'll skip this state. But if we're on a paginate function, then we've already got a listener going from that original search. And we can find that actually if I scroll down a little bit. I'll skip over some of the query stuff, but take a look at, so we've got context.state.search listeners. This is what's holding the listener. In fact, I can probably highlight this whole thing and see where that shows up down here. And so that's when I finally actually do my search or my query on Firebase, I call the onSnapshot, which is a query that repeats itself anytime there's any changes to what I'm querying. I get an update. So I need to store that function that does that somewhere so that I can cancel it, because every time I click Paginate, every time I click one of these buttons, I'm calling this function again, which means I'm calling that onSnapshot again, and I'm creating a new listener every time I click that button. So that's why each time it's called, I want to not only store it, in this place. I'm storing it on the listeners by this is a static variable at this point, the query ID. That just comes in right now. That comes in from the dashboard in my original objects. That is the the query ID. That's that unique thing I said I needed to keep or to name so that I can differentiate my different listeners. So again, back to this. If I had 3 of these things, each one of them has a unique name. That's this unique name. It's pretty much hard-coded. It's not going to change, which means in the store, you can replace this part right here with that hard-coded name. So basically, every time I call anything from a given, a given search box, I'm passing in that same unique ID, basically. And so, back to the point, every time a button's clicked or something, I create a new query, and I have to store what onSnapshot does is it returns a function that you can call that will cancel the listener, so that it will no longer listen to updates. So each time I change my query, so every time I click next, I'm changing the parameters of my query. Next or previous, I'm changing the parameters because I'm changing my start point. If I was doing the same query, I would have the same results every time. But when I click next, I'll talk about this in a little bit. I want to change my start point to being after this last one. The start point is now, this next guy. So every time I click a button, I'm saying this a million times, but I'm trying to hammer it home. Every time I click a button, I get a new listener, and I store that listener in that same place. But every time I come into my function, so every time I click a button, as we discussed earlier, in entity search, whether I'm paginating or creating a new one, and that's, again, maybe this is annoying going too far back. I apologize if it is. But, the create is when it first loads, or previous or next. That's the buttons. So that's here in the dashboard. This is the code for that. Either I'm paginating or creating, which calls, sorry for the change, they both call that root entity dispatch. That's this. So on create, I first come in. This isn't set up yet. There's no listener yet because it's the first time I'm searching. But if I'm paginating forward, there will be a listener. And I want to get rid of that old search. The old search, before I hit, if I'm on this search and I click next, this is my new search. The search that was here, I don't care about anymore because it's off screen. I don't need to know about it anymore. And I want to constantly update my search points. I don't want to store that old one because if things change, then it starts to get very goofy as far as, if something comes in between this state and this state, my pagination points start to get screwed up. And that's something in depth that I may not talk about just now. But just know that, what I'm trying to do is only keep one listener for this entire box here, for this search. And I want it to be the most recent search that's done based on the start point and all that stuff. And we'll talk about the start point in a second. So again, for the 1000th time, that's what I'm doing here. If there's an old search, get rid of that old search. I don't want to listen to it anymore because I'm going to create a new search and I'm going to put that same search in this same place. And again, the onSnapshot function, when I do my search, so this is when I finally do the search on the store, this onSnapshot returns a function that I'm storing in this variable. It returns a function that you can call that will cancel the listener. So that's what I'm doing here is I'm actually taking that variable right there, and now what this says here is execute that function that's stored in that variable. So I'm executing the function and I'm killing that old search because I'm going to set up a new search. If I haven't hammered that home enough, I guess go back and watch it again and you can hear me say all that stuff 1,000 times again. All right, so now let's start talking about the search, the query, the actual query on the Firestore. So that's what I do here. I start the query. I create this base query thing that allows me to change the, what I'm doing on it. Am I doing an order by? Do I have a where clause? And that's all the stuff that's set up in the dashboard, which is the search params. Remember, the search params are set in the dashboard here. This is the, the initial setup of the search. That I take this object that defines my search, I pass it to the entity search, and then the entity search ultimately passes it to the store, and it comes through as this search params object. So, I call Firebase Firestore collection. So this would be a collection reference that I'm setting up, and the collection is, on my search params collection ID. In this case, the collection ID is my root entity dot collection ID. So I'm calling the root entity whatever the collection ID is of this root entity. So that could be anything, but that's going to search, whatever, going to tell Firebase which collection to search on. Then I look to see if there's an OrderBy clause. So you don't have to have an OrderBy clause. I could just search for everything on the collection, but usually you want an OrderBy. So I allow the setup to have an OrderBy clause. Here's my hard-coded OrderBy clause. I'm going to order by the created at, and I'm going to go in the descending direction. So that's what this sets up. If the OrderBy is there, it says, hey, this is the case for when we're doing a paginate. Remember, I talked about in the entity search when we originally step back. When we originally create the function, we just pass through the search params, which does not have the pagination direction on it. So once I start paginating, I'm adding this parameter to the search params, which is sent here, but it just doesn't. I haven't added this yet to it, and I give it the direction. So that's based on the click, right? If I choose the previous button. So here's the previous button, and if I click on it, I choose paginate backwards. So I'm sending backwards into the direction variable here, and that ultimately gets put on the pagination direction on the search parameters object, and then I pass the search parameters through. So when we're in the store and I see search params.pagination direction, this would only get called if we were now paginating forward or backwards, which we're not doing yet. We're on the initial call. So we're going to skip right into this else statement, and we're going to do the order by based on how it's set up in the object that's sent in, the search params object. So here's my field path, my direction string, again, field path, and a direction string. So just basically taking that search and sticking it in the query, or taking those options and sticking it in the query. Later we'll see that if I want to do a backwards search, Firestore doesn't make it easy to get a search point that is in the backwards direction. So actually, let me talk about that now because I'll probably forget. So if these are what I'm searching, let's say that these are my database objects. They're very simple, right? I'm just looking at one parameter of the object, but this is my order by clause. When it's ID or whatever. This could be a timestamp, whatever I'm ordering by. If this is my data set, and say I want to get, normally when I do my first search, I'm going to start from the beginning and get right now I'm set to get two objects. So this is what I get. Then you click the next button, and then you get 3 and 4, and then you click the next button, you get 5 and 6. My current one only has 5, but regardless. But once we go from, so we get this search, and we bring back 1 and 2, and now we click the next button, and that goes and gets us 3 and 4. Once I'm on 3 and 4, it's hard to tell Firestore how to go back and get these two, because I need to start from a point. But I don't know what these 2 points are unless I stored it from my previous query. But if I started in the middle here, and these were my 2 objects that I returned and was displaying, i.e., if that was the 2 objects that I'm displaying here, and those were their IDs that I was searching and sorting by, it's hard to go back and get this guy to paginate backwards, to step back to and then look forward. Firestore makes it easy to go, hey, I've got this search point, the 004, I've got this start at thing I can call that lets me get the next 2. So, and that's where this start after comes in, start at, start after, and I'll pull that up in the documentation real quick. So here's Firestore's, I'm in the guide, and I'm paginate with query cursors. Here's what Firestore says to do when you want to paginate. Basically, you do your search. So here's my DB collection, my order by, and my limit. That's the stuff I'm setting up right now. And they're doing a then instead of an onSnapshot, which is just a, actually they're doing a get instead of an onSnapshot, which is, it's a static one-time search. Mine is I'm continually listening to the changes. But what they do is, see, when you want to paginate, you use this start after clause or start after method, and you give it a starting point. And the starting point you can give it is the last visible object. And the last visible object is set up here, and it comes from the returned object that they give you. So when you call the get, you get this object back with your results, and your results.docs is an array that contains all the different documents that are the search. So that would be, in my example here, that's this, everything in here. If the limit is 2, then it looks like just 2 entities. If the limit was 6, it would look like that. So that the array would have each one of these documents if each one of these represents a document. Or the ID of a document. So the actual document, though, is what's inside this array. And so what they do to get the last one to start paginating on, they say, hey, in those results, here's the results that get passed in after the, because get is an asynchronous function. So you reach out to the store, you do the search, which means go get my results. And when they're done, when that asynchronous functionality is called, it calls this then function and passes in the document snapshots variable, or the object that contains the results. And so when you call that doc method, you get those results, and so they're just calling it again, but finding out how long it is and getting the last one of the array. So ultimately what they're doing, if this was the search, and it retrieved all these results, this was the array 1 through 6, it's saying, hey, give me the last element of the array. So give me that 006 object and all its data. Whoops, I lost my page there. So that's what they're doing here. This right here is getting that last element of the array and storing it on the last visible object. So then when we do a next query, the next query, we start after that last object. I lost my place here. Where's my... So let's say the query was for 3, a limit of 3, and we got these 3 in that array, and then we say, hey, give me that last... this last visible, give me the last element of that array. That's what this does. So it's saying, give me this one. And then we're going to use that one to say start after that one, which my next set of results is therefore going to be starting at 4. So I pulled in 3. I said, give me this one here. And then we're going to start after it on our next search. And so that's what they're doing here. They're pulling in that last visible, and they're passing that last visible and saying, hey, on my next search, start after that last visible and get the next and go forward from there. They're doing a limit of 25. What I just showed was a limit of 3, right? So hopefully that starts to explain that a little bit. And I know this is getting long. Wow, I'm already going on 30 minutes because my voice is going hoarse. And I got a long ways to go, so I'm going to take a break here a second. All right, back from a water break, and I just want to talk about again. So you can see on that last thing that I was talking about, say we were doing a search, and this was our most recent search. It's easy to search forward because I can use this guy and the start after clause to get the next things coming up. But there's nothing that says, there's nothing in Firebase that says, hey, let me, from one of these data points that I have, go back 3 and get me that information. So what I ultimately have to do is I have to, when I need to search in the backwards direction, I have to do some trickery. That's why I put in here in the comments, I'm doing some trickery. I actually have to reverse the search sort. So if the search was descending, so if my direction string is equal to descending on a normal search, I should send in descending to Firebase, but I'm actually going to trick things and I'm going to reverse it to ascending, because that allows me to then go backwards. So if my array is now, if I'm starting at this point, let's say this is my search that I was returned, and I say, hey, let's go and use this as my starting point, and now instead of searching forward, which is in this case ascending, I'll search in the descending direction, and then I'll start at 3, and if I start after 4, I'll get 3 and 2 in the descending direction. But now notice my data will be backwards, because when the search results come back, it'll be 003, 002, because I'm searching in the descending direction. And so that won't line up. My data would actually be backwards. And that's actually where I'll do some trickery again down later, that if things are backwards after my search comes through, here's my backwards after the search, I'm going to reverse that array, and I'm going to use the opposite starting points. I know that's probably not very clear right now, and whether or not it will become clear is an interesting thing we'll find out going forward. So anyway, the backwards direction is when we have clicked a forward or the backwards button. We have to fake the query and tell it to search in that backwards direction. So hopefully I made that somewhat clear. Anyway, I'm going to move forward a little bit here. Next thing we'll set up is the where clause. The where clause is again set up by my original object that I'm setting up back in the dashboard that defines the search for the given given display point that I'm trying to work on. So that sets up the where clause and basically just passes in the field names. Now, here's where we start getting into pagination again. So if it was an original search on the created function, then the entity created function and not a paginate, this would get skipped. Whoops, don't want to change that. This would get skipped because there is no pagination direction at that point, so it would get skipped. But if we're paginating forward, then we want to start our query. I want to add to my base query object. I want to start after the last root entity, and that last root entity is actually something that comes from my storage object that I'll talk about in a few minutes. I store that page forward document point. So I'm storing this right here from the documentation. I'm getting my query, and after I get my query, I'm storing that last visible document to be used in my start after. So that's basically following the documentation right there. So then if the direction is backwards, so I'm just going to pull that backwards doc, which I'll talk about, that I'm storing. But basically it's the same thing, but instead of getting if we're looking at their documentation on this document snapshots, remember this is the results, and the results.docs is all the different docs in the results. To get the last visible, they're getting the length -1, which is the last element of the array. To get the first visible, which would allow us to search backwards, we want to get the 0th element of that array. So that's why I get that page backward, which ultimately ends up being the 0th element on a forward search. And again, things get goofy with backward searches. So where am I? here's that backwards direction. So if I'm going to page backwards when I'm doing my search, so forget about this again, just to talk about it on this thing. So if I have this search, let's say my search returns 3 results, my limit is 3. Then my last visible is 4, and my 0th element of my results, that the results.doc array, is the 002. So basically, I'm storing this in my Paginate backwards, and I'm storing this in my Paginate forward. So that's my Paginate forward, and that's my Paginate backwards. So I'm just storing those 2 documents to be referenced later, so that I can put them in the start after, and that way I can get results starting from a given point. Otherwise, if I don't do that, then I don't have a functional forward and backwards, because I'm always going to do the same search, and I'm always going to start from the same point if I don't give it a different start point. And then here's my limit. I have a hard-coded default limit of 10, but if the search parameters, and that's again back to this, if I define a limit in the search parameters, I say if it's a number and it's greater than 0, okay, let's set the limit equal to what the parameters are that I sent in, and then I do that to my query. So I take my base query object and I do limit, and I pass in that limit. So everything I'm doing up to this point, I could have put all that stuff, this .OrderBy. Normally you'll see this .OrderBy directly on here like this, and then .limit. But I can't do if statements in between these things. So what I do is I take part of my query, I start my query, I store that result on this base query object, and then I can take that base query object and further modify it. Modify it with the OrderBy and the where clauses, and then I just set it back equal to itself. So I take that base query, I modify the query. That's going to return an object that I store back in that originally object, and then I can move forward. And basically, I'm building this query. What this is doing, each of these, is the same as building the query forward in this direction, as you would normally see, but because my parameters are optional, I have to do it a little different. So I'm storing it on this base query. And that kind of gets into the documentation too, where if we start to go into the reference section, that's where you can see that on the JavaScript side in the Firestore, if I originally my collection reference is what's here. This .collection returns, when I call .collection, that's returning a collection reference to the base query object. So base query is now a collection reference. And that's just a given thing that I'm telling you. You can look that up from the documentation, but to make it quicker, I'm starting from there, and that's what this is, a collection reference. So what can I do on a collection reference? Well, I've got the methods of add, the .doc, which I talked about kind of, end at, end before. Wow, looking at the documentation here, I just had to pause because this might be the solution to my problems. Maybe I can search backwards with Firebase. I have to play with this. I'm going to continue on with this video, but I may be coming back and saying, hey, there is a solution here. Now, I actually asked on the board, on the Firestore board, if there was something like that. I have to play with this. The response was no, I had to do what I'm doing, but I'm going to have to play with this. Anyway, I'm going to move on and talk about where I was going, which was, here's limit, the limit, and order by and start after. So all these things, if we look at the documentation here, it returns a Firestore query object. Same with, whoops, I didn't want to click on that. Order by returns a query object. Returns a query object. I can go on forever, right? The end before returns a query object. The start after returns a query object. And that query object is, I'll talk about that in a second, but in our code, when I call order by on base query, so right now, after this call, this thing returns a collection reference. And now base query is a collection reference, so the next time we see it is here. Then we get OrderBy. We call OrderBy on it, and I just saw that in the documentation that a collection, this is the collection reference we're in. If I scroll up, here's the collection reference, and then I go back down, I have the OrderBy method. Here's the OrderBy method on it, and then that returns a query object. So when I call this on base query, I modify my query, and now base query is now a query object that has been returned. And it turns out a query object is not much different than a collection reference object. The collection reference has an OrderBy method, and so does the query. It also should have an OrderBy. So they're the same, even though I'm getting different objects returned. But now once I get into this query thing, now everything's going to return a query itself. So it's going to keep returning queries, unless I call the actual get or on snapshot functions. Where's the snapshot? On snapshot. So basically, OrderBy returns to this base query object. This base query object is now that query, this query reference, this query object that I'm looking at. And so same with the where clause. The where clause returns a base query. So base query has a where method that returns a query object. Same with the start after. So that's what happens as I pass down. You can start to see what objects are getting returned and what type of methods you can use on them based on the documentation. So anyway, I think I was way down here in the limit section, and I kind of forgot where I was going because I've been talking forever. At 42 minutes, this is getting ridiculous. Hopefully it's helpful, otherwise I'm just wasting my voice. Maybe someday for me I'll come back and listen to it and, when I need to remember what I'm doing. So ultimately at this point right here, I should say this point right here, my base query is the query that I've built based on the input parameters. And so now I'm going to call onSnapshot. I'm going to go out to Firebase. I'm going to say, hey, get me the results. And with that results, every time something changes in my results, send me an update. And that's why I talked about this in a past video, but that's why when we'll see if these are still, sometimes my app crashes in the debug mode, but we'll see if they're still live, that when I change that, yep. So that's why I'm seeing this update live, because I called an onSnapshot, which updates the query when anything within it changes. If I had just called a .get, which is in the documentation here, this .get is a one-time call, and that won't update my results real time. And I talked about that in another video. So anyway, and I talked about this previously in this video, that onSnapshot returns a listener, and I store that listener so I can cancel it and put a new one in there to listen to, so that I don't build up, for every click of a button, I don't have 5 snapshot listeners, because each one of them is going to do the same modification. So if I've got 5 listeners going and one's in the backward direction and one's got a different starting point, I'm going to get crazy results, because they're each going to, make their changes as they're received, and it's received asynchronously. They could come in any order. It's just not predictable. So I need to delete the old ones when I start a new one, and that just makes sense, because I only want to be listening to one query at a time. I don't want to be listening to my old queries, because we're past that point. So then this is some notes for myself on, we're going to skip that stuff. I've got it commented out, but there's issues where if there's no connection to the database, I'm not covering for that right now. And this right here is just debug stuff that I'm console logging out. But anyway, after the query is finished, it sends the results to the function I'm giving it here, the query snapshot results. So query snapshot contains a query document snapshot object, and so if we go back to the the reference section, that is this right here, a query document snapshot. And so we can see the different stuff that we can do on this object. We've got the data method, which goes and gets the data for the particular objects. But what I'm doing is I believe I'm doing a for each, but I'm not seeing it. Let me see. Hang on one second. Let's go back to the code. So query snapshot, query document snapshot. Do I have the right one? Query document snapshot. I got to figure out what I'm doing wrong here. Maybe it's supposed to be a query snapshot. Let me figure it out and come back. Oh, silly me, I can't read my own documentation. The doc that's returned from the query snapshot is a query snapshot document object. This thing that I'm running the for each on, this query snapshot, is what's returned from the onSnapshot function. So let's take a look at that. That is the so query onSnapshot. It returns a function, but it passes to the function you pass to it to call each time the snapshot listener is invoked. It receives a query snapshot. So this query snapshot, that's why I called it query snapshot. Again, this is all just nothing. The first thing I do with that query snapshot is here. So here's the onSnapshot returns a query snapshot. And so if I go to query snapshot here in the reference, I see that I can call a for each function, which is going to loop through each of the documents that were found in the results. So ultimately, now this is the query snapshot, if I'm using the right terminology. Yes, query snapshot. Query snapshot would contain, if I had a limit of 3 and a starting point of 2, or start after 1, or start at 2, this would be my results. And so I'm doing a for each and getting getting each one of these back in the for each. So what are these things in this context? Those things are this doc thing that gets passed back from the for each, and it happens to be a query document snapshot. And let's see if the documentation says that. So the callback function, that's what I'm passing to it, is I'm passing a callback function. That's what this function is. I'm passing a callback function to the for each. Here's my callback function, and it gets passed, when it's invoked, it gets passed a query document snapshot. And so that's what I'm documenting here, is that each one of these docs, this doc right here, that this doc that's shown throughout, is a query document snapshot. And so if I go and look at the query document snapshot, there's lots of things I can get on that. I can get the actual data, which is the field values, and I should be able to get maybe the ID is something I make up on my own. So what I do is I take that doc.data. Remember, query snapshot.data returns the data. I'm going to go back and show that again. So here's I'm on the query snapshot. Here's the .data method. And so it returns the document data, which is the actual field parameters, and that's my actual my actual data that populates this. So that's the actual first name, last name fields. That's what's actually getting returned. So that's what I'm storing in this result object.data. I'm storing the actual data from the query, and then I'm storing the doc ID, which is the doc.id. So there must be a ID on that query. Let me pause and figure out what I'm missing here. So here's what I'm missing is query document snapshot extends document snapshot. Here's the extends. So if I go to the document snapshot, it adds functionality to this, and this should have an ID field here where I can get the ID. So query document snapshot is also a, you can think of it as also being a document snapshot object, because it's got all the same, it extends it, so it's got all the same base functionality, and that's where I pull the ID from. And so I store that in my query results object. So basically I'm going and getting, I've got this snapshot object that they give me, I'm going and getting the results and putting them in my own array, and storing them with the, not only the data, but the reference to the ID, which ultimately I'm going to use. The reason I'm storing that is so that I can get the link in my search. That's where this search result doc ID, that's how I load my next search. Let's see, no, I'm sorry, that's how I load the the actual entity. So if it's part of creating my link. So when I'm here in my search and I actually click on this guy to go and edit his stuff, it's that I'm storing the ID, and that's how I set it up here. So that's a little deeper than I need to get in this video, but just know that I have to save that doc ID for a reason, and that's why that's kind of goofy like that. So I set up my results, and then I store them ultimately in this search object that I'm going to pass or going to set on my my root entity, which is ultimately going to get displayed. So that this results that I've set up here, or this results object that I'm storing the data in the ID, I push it onto this results, and so this is my results that gets put on my search object as a results thing. And so in entity.search, basically what it's looping over to show, so search results is the loop, the v4 search results, that's the loop that shows this data, and that loop comes from, it's a computed variable. Search results is a computed variable that goes out to the store, that current root entities, based on the query ID, again, that unique ID for this individual search, and here's my results. It gets the results, so I'm basically looping over to display them. Remember, everything's asynchronous, right? So I can't just load my data and expect it to be there. That's what this stuff does, is make sure that it's actually there. If it's not there, then I just return an empty object so I don't get JavaScript errors. But once I actually do get the results, now I'm going to loop over the results. And what are the results? That's what I'm storing. My query that I was just talking about, that for each, that I'm looping over all the documents, I'm putting them in this array, and saving that on this object, which ultimately gets committed to the Vuex storage. So I take that object, I commit it to the storage, and that gets stored to, if I look at so I'll actually look at this function, which is up here. Here's the commit, and it's ultimately storing it on the current root entities object by the search object ID. So the current object, query ID, you'll see that here again. The query ID, the variable name is different here, but the query ID is ultimately the thing we're looking at on the current root entity. So that's let's go back to the bottom. That's the search, and so I'm storing my results in a global object that Vue is picking up in the presentation side. And it's dynamic, so that when this search results change, because it's a computed function, every time the onSnapshot is called with new results, this current root entities .results is going to change. So my front end is going to change. And so that's what's happening when I'm on something like this and I click next, I called onSnapshot, I changed the data in the Vuex store, and the front end then recognized that change and then updated the list of what it was displaying. So hopefully some of that's clear. I know this is probably getting pretty deep and hard to follow. So finally, as this has gone on for an hour, and nobody's ever going to watch this whole thing, I'm probably going to start to cut this short. I think I've pretty much talked about a lot of it. Again, the page forward, the page backward is special cases that I have to handle. And that's why I have these clause where if it's backwards, I'm searching backwards, I then have to search backwards and then reverse the array and actually do the opposite. With the page forward doc is actually the the 0th element, where in the for the regular forward search, the page forward was the last element. The dot length -1 is the last element. So just doing some goofy stuff in order to be able to search backwards, which hopefully I gave a little bit of an introduction into, and it may all be for nothing once I look into that end at, if that is actually something that's viable. And so that's pretty much it. I could walk through it again, for each case as far as the initial setup where I skip each of the the backwards and the forwards on the initial. None of that stuff gets called, but I don't know that that's totally worthwhile at this point. There is one more thing. I'm going to pause. I remembered I wanted to talk about one more thing. Let's see if I can try and figure out what it was. Oh, I did want to, so I wanted to show what it means to be in the forward and reverse direction and how that affects things. So if I go back to the dashboard and I load all these guys fresh on the dashboard, they'll all have the same data, and they'll all, have 5. They're all the same thing, right? They all have 5. So now I'm going to start over and go back to the beginning. And so this one I'm going to keep as a regular search, an initial, so it's in the forward direction. This one I'm going to page forward, and I'm going to page back. So now this search is actually a reverse search that I am then reversing the array to look like a forward search. So this search currently has pagination direction equal to backwards. So all these backwards things are going to get called. Is there a better way to do this? Just minimize this, right? This one has the forward search. This one is now a backward search because I clicked next and previous. So I'm on a previous search, and my onSnapshot is based on a backward search. So let's see what happens when I add a new entity. Now remember, this one's starting at the 0 place, or actually let's delete an entity. So let's delete Marco Polo. I'm going on the fly here. This may... So we can see that they're both still live. I'll make Mark back to Marco. They're both still live, but now what happens when I delete Marco? I get different results. And that's because this guy's searching forward, so Marco was the first one. It's gone, so it's searching forward from that point of 0 and finding 2. Billy Bob is searching in the reverse direction, and the first one's gone. Well, there's nothing behind it, so there's nothing really to get. So basically what I've done here is if I was at 0, at 1 and 2 is what I was displaying, and then I deleted 1. Well, the forward search was just goes and finds it gets a limit of 2 from the starting point, which was the 0, 1, but it's gone, so it's going to search forward from that point. The reverse was I was searching for 2 and 1, but I was searching backwards, and now 1 is gone. Whoops. Now 1 is gone, but my starting point is 2, and I'm searching backwards. Well, there's nothing backwards, so it doesn't find anything, so it doesn't replace it with anything. So hopefully that's somewhat clear, but that's why this guy didn't have anything, and this guy ended up showing the next object going forward. This guy's looking backwards. There's nothing backwards, so it doesn't find it. And that's kind of the issue I'm having right now is dealing with that. Do I even care? Really, right now, for for this database, it's not that big of a deal for these two to be off because the person will still be able to click next and still get that information. It's there. It's just I've got different start points. And most of the time, I mean, there's going to be thousands of entries where, you know, there'll still be 40 or 50 if something gets deleted. And rarely will something get deleted anyway. So, and then the other object, the other edge case that I haven't accounted for again is what I talked about in the beginning of this video, is where if I click next and I get to the end and I go too far, I've got nothing. And remember, my my searches are based on my my start after. Well, if I click forward, my start after is based on the previous search, but the previous search came back empty, so there's no starting point. So when I click next, I'm probably even getting an error in the source. Nope, I don't want to view the source. I want to view the inspection in the console. I'm getting errors because the start after is not defined. Well, that's because it's an empty array that I put nothing in. So I'm sure that's not very clear, but just know that I know that I'm getting errors. So at least I somewhat know that what I'm talking about. All right, so that's the longest I could have ever talked for. I'm going to go stick my head under some water or maybe take a steam bath or something and try and get my throat to work again. My throat is in an incredible amount of pain for a person that never talks and just sits and stares at a keyboard all day long. That's a lot of talking. But hopefully, if you didn't fully understand the whole, how everything's working, and I know it wasn't extremely clear on how the backwards search works, hopefully you got something out of it. If nothing else, hopefully just me showing how to navigate through the documentation and understanding, based on, what you're calling and what you're returning, you can look at the documentation and see, see what type of object you're looking at. I'm trying to show it, but I'm failing. You can look at the object reference, the references, and start to see, what object am I currently working with, and what are the methods that I have available on that object, and then what does that, what does that call, that method, what does it return, and then you can just kind of learn how to do things on your own as opposed to just trying to work from a single, a single static thing here that it's great for its direct case, but when you want to start doing more advanced things, you really got to start getting into the reference section. So hopefully, me pointing some of that stuff out, if anything, was helpful. Maybe some of that other stuff wasn't extremely helpful. But again, I'm going to look into that start before or whatever it was, and see if that's going to help me at all. And that'll probably just be a whole nother video where I start from scratch. Anyway, Terry Caliendo, Dedicated Managers, rambling on. Have a great day. I'm going hoarse. 2:02 p.m. I need to actually get back to my client work and get some of that stuff done before I lose all my clients. Take care. Have a great day. If you want to collaborate, shoot me a message, terry@dedicatedmanagers.com. Dedicated Managers is the company website. If you want to get involved, feel free to call me. Feel free to contact me. Always looking to collaborate. Looking to create a team where we can go and solve some big company problems and really start to build something here. So if you're into this and you want to get further into it, you want to work together, give me a call. Take care. Have a great day. Happy coding.